I think a lot of what needs to be said on the issue has been said, so I'll try to be brief because I am interested in, some level of dialogue. But one thing I think that it's very important for us to note that when we talk about these outcomes that are impacting, African American, Latino students, primarily and low-income students, this is not normal. This is not a normal occurrence. I don't want us to believe because we've seen it this way for years, this is just the way things are supposed to play out. I often say that, there's clear biological data that indicates that regardless of race or ethnicity, we're 99.6% the same. 99.6% the same. In fact, there are more genes in our bodies to explain the variance in our eye color than our racial or ethnic differences. So to the degree that we're 99.6% the same, any variance that we see in educational outcome that's identifiable by race, ethnicity, or gender is not caused by the racial or ethnic differences, but the social policies and social practices which create those differences. So it's not the difference, it's the social policies and social practices which create. So we have to begin to unpack what are the social policies and social practices which are in place right now, which allow us to identify by race or ethnicity who's more likely to graduate, who's less likely to be in gifted and talented courses, who's more likely to be suspended or expelled, and identify those and eliminate them because they're not normal. Now, because we have not eliminated them and addressed them, we know that there's a correlation between educational attainment and other areas, a correlation between educational attainment and a community's economic base, a correlation between educational attainment and access to health care, a correlation between educational attainment and civic participation, voting, volunteerism. So again, it creates this image of a population, of a group that it creates this negative image. But I don't want us to accept that this is a normal occurrence. In fact, if we think back on when ESEA was first put forth by Lyndon B. Johnson, it was a part of Lyndon B. Johnson's in 1965 War on Poverty. Today we talk about, accountability, assessments and all, but it was a part of a war on poverty, understanding that education is a vehicle that we can use to address these other pieces. And I still believe that our public educational system is the strongest platform that we have to begin to address larger social issues because it is the only mandatory network of institutions in our country. Mandatory network. And if we find a way to align the right supports with our public educational system, then we can begin to address those other issues. And when I say, hear me right, align the right supports, not require that the teachers who are there support areas that they're not trained to support. But align the right supports to those public schools, we can begin to address the issues that are impacting our students. At the top of it, I believe that many of our districts and schools, we have what I would call a push out and a lockout issue. A push out issue from the perspective that there are practices, policies and practices which have the sum effect of pushing too many students out. Whether you talk about the out-of-school suspension rates, the expulsion rates, we know that these are policies and practices which have the tendency of pushing students out of the place where we need them to be educated in large numbers. And it more negatively impacts low-income, African-American, Latino students. We have a lockout issue where there are students in the classroom who are still locked out of the resources and the supports that they need to have a fair and substantive opportunity to learn. So we've got to approach both of those columns, both of those buckets, and begin to unpack what are those policies, what are those practices to address them. At the Shaw Foundation, for years we've been talking about providing every student a fair and substantive opportunity to learn. And we measure this not by the students who are at the top, but what are the conditions and circumstances for those students who are, at the bottom. And we looked at graduation rates. We've been doing it for close to a decade now, every 2 years, publishing a report. And we found out that after we disaggregated the data by race and gender, that each As it relates to four-year graduation rates, black in 35 of the 48 states where there was reliable data, black males were at the bottom. Now, Latino males were second to the bottom in another 12 states. But we wanted to understand now what are the policies and practices and conditions which create the outcomes where black males are at the bottom as it relates to graduation rate. The outcome where we can predict nationally black male graduation rate of 59%, a Latino male graduation rate of 65%, a white male graduation rate of 80%. Not normal, again. But what are the policies and practices that allow us to predict this? And so we publish a report every year, and as the case has been in the past, yes, we were able to find these trends. But we were also able to look at some states where black males are performing at a very high level, and in fact, in some places, performing at a higher level as it relates to four-year graduation rates than their white male peers. What states do you all think that where black males are performing at a higher rate? What states? Massachusetts? Come on, use your words. Maryland? Okay, there were places like, what was it? Texas? There were places like North Dakota, Vermont. Massachusetts was pretty high. But places where they were so small in population that they could not be relegated or isolated in under-resourced spaces. And where they were educated in those spaces, they performed on par or at a higher level. Likewise, we wanted to understand what was the outcome for white males who were in under-resourced spaces. So we looked at Detroit, where the black male graduation rate for four-year period is 23%, but the white male graduation rate was 13%. Now, some would say that there are fewer, number of white males in there, sort of trapped in the system, but it highlights the fact that this issue around outcomes and high outcomes is not just about race and ethnicity, but it's about providing students an opportunity to learn. What makes it an issue of race or ethnicity goes back to what we talked about. We're more likely to relegate these students to places where they don't have the support and resources that they need to succeed or perform at a level as other students are performing. And that's at the core of it. That's why, because we have not appropriately implemented ESEA as a part of the war on poverty legislation, we have all of these states that rightfully so and advocates that rightfully so have filed these lawsuits. And each state has a lawsuit like they have a state bird. In California, it's a Williams case. New York, CFE. They have the Thornton Commission down in Maryland. In New Jersey, it's Abbott. Rightfully so. But at the same time, we've got to figure out, number one, what are those supports? Yes, we need the resources. We need the dollars. But once we get the dollars, what are the supports that are necessary in order for each child to have a fair and substantive opportunity to learn? And number two, how do we operationalize the delivery of those supports to the students? Because having them is one thing. Getting them to the students who need them the most is another thing. As we found out with the last iteration of ESEA, and there was a provision in there called supplemental service. For students who are behind, you get tutored, it makes sense. But there was a problem in distributing and getting the resources to parents, the awareness of parents, and getting the resources to students. So we've got to figure out both. How do we get the resources? How do we transfer those resources into the meaningful supports that students need? And how do we deliver those supports to the students? We've been talking a lot at the foundation about what we would call providing students with personal opportunity plans. And any state, locality would identify what category of students would be eligible for these plans. But it will be a plan to outline the additional academic, socio-emotional, and health supports. So if a student, and I'm making this up, if a student is a grade level or more behind, the student would be eligible for a plan. The plan would identify what are the additional academic, whether those academic supports are tutoring, extended day learning, ELL supports, whatever the case. What are the additional socio-emotional supports? Whether there's clear data that indicates having a mentor actually helps. And I think it's great, and I've said this a lot, I think it's great that there are volunteer organizations who are mentoring and working with young kids, but it's not enough. If we know that having a mentor helps, and it's a part of what's necessary to get some students to perform at the level of their abilities, then it should be a part of the system and paid for out of the state and local coffers, budgets. Some have said, how do we do such a thing? You know, where do we find this money? But I think it's about making a choice, because we pay for probationary officers out of these budgets. And often these students end up in places where it costs us more to keep them there. So it seems to me that if we invest in the mentors on the front end, we can project a lower number of beds needed in the prison on the back end, and there's some cost savings there. To me, it seems like opportunity budgeting. So, and then there's there's been the argument around, well, what do we do with all the jobs? This is about jobs. Well, I've talked with some folk that work in prisons across the country, and they would rather be mentors. If the job is there, they would rather be mentors, because they themselves have said they feel trapped by working in this dynamic. So we've got to think about, how do we create an opportunity industry to deliver the supports that are necessary to provide all students an opportunity to learn. An opportunity industry. Think outside of the box of where we are right now. Where we are right now won't get us there. It's as stark as a shift from standards-based reform to transition to supports-based reform. From standards-based reform to supports. Because we have standards. Standards have been concretized. And we know that there are students who are not meeting the standards. Well, the million-dollar question now is, what are the supports to allow them to meet those standards? And there are a host of questions that we're going to have to answer. Don't be afraid of the questions, because if we think back when we started this standards-based movement, there were a host of questions. What are the right standards? What's the benchmark? Some we answered right, some we answered wrong. Now we've got to answer that on the support side, so that we can give students this fair and substantive opportunity to learn. So academic supports, socio-emotional supports, and finally health supports. What are the health challenges? We can identify the health challenges which serve as barriers to a student's opportunity to learn. Asthma, eyesight, mental health. Whole group of students who are suffering from emotional trauma that our schools are not prepared and don't necessarily have the support right now to address. Well, you can't take a student through the learning process if we are not able to address those types of issues. So in short, these issues have to be placed on the table. Yes, we need the resources. Yes, we need to identify how we're going to use those resources and the supports. Yes, we need to identify a mechanism for delivering the supports to each child. And the current paradigm won't get us there. It won't even get us there for high-achieving students. So what we're doing now doesn't even work for high-achieving students. That being said, ESEA was an anti-poverty bill. ESEA today doesn't hit the mark. Even the version that was just dropped by Murray and Lindsey Graham, it doesn't hit the mark. Because in there's nothing that talks about anything around early childhood education, which should be an important part of it. There's nothing that talks about subgroup accountability. And furthermore, there's no action if someone misses the benchmark. So I hope that when we hear these policy recommendations, we're putting it up against a frame of not what currently exists, but a frame of what's necessary in order to provide an opportunity to learn to all students. It's not what's politically feasible that we should care about. It's what's educationally sound.